Into the sermon, we are in the process of finalizing arrangements for where we will be holding services for the Feast of Trumpets. And it looks like we're going to be hosting it in Lafayette again this coming Holy Day. Now, I solicit your prayers on that. In this way, we have been combing things in Baton Rouge and in Lafayette, and the only place that we have been able to come up with in both areas is a very nice facility at USL, and it's a real nice place there, a real nice auditorium there in the Student Union. But we've talked to them and we've seen it, and the only thing we need is official approval from USL's board that they want to rent to us. They have asked on 2 or 3 occasions, well, now, exactly what are you going to be doing? Well, we're going to be having a church service. Well, they call about, well, now, exactly what are you going to do at this service? I don't know if they think we're going to pass snakes around and handle them or what. I decided against humor by making some offhanded comment of, well, we're going to sacrifice bulls and goats, or I thought, better leave something like that unsaid. They'll take it seriously, and that'll really throw them into a dither. So, I finally, we talked to them. I thought we'd explained it, and then they called back Mr. Alvarado, and they told him that they needed some information in writing as to exactly what it was that we had in mind. So, I have dispatched them a letter detailing out the things that we have in mind, and so I appreciate your prayers that they will, everything will get lined out. We'll see how fervently everybody prays, because at this point, if this doesn't work out, the alternative is that we all go to the Baton Rouge Church Hall in Prairieville and we put everyone in with a shoehorn. Because it's just about going to be that tight. I think we can. I'm told that they can get that many people in there. I hope that we don't have to prove it, this trumpet. So anyway, your prayers are appreciated. Well, I want to get into a subject today that is very basic. There is the joke that was told of the little boy that had gone to church, and he came back home, and his dad asked him, he said, well, son, what did the preacher preach about today? And the little boy said, well, he preached on sin. And his father said, well, what did he have to say about it? He's against it. So, that's kind of a broad generality. I guess the little kid felt he was pretty safe on those guesses. Well, I intend to preach about sin today, and I also am against it. But I intend to be a little bit more specific than that, because, there are many ideas that people have about what is sin. Now, different groups have different concepts. Certain churches, many of you came out of a Catholic background, and you are familiar with 2 classifications of sin. There is mortal sin and venial sin. And so you get into classifications. Now you look up those terms in the Bible, and you won't find them. Those are not terms that come out of the Bible, but nevertheless they are terms that have been accepted and have been taught. Other churches, various religions have different ideas and different concepts of sin. Some will tell you that a sip of wine or a deck of cards is a sin. Boy, you're going to go straight to hellfire. And I can remember I remember as a boy growing up in a particular Baptist church, and we had a particular preacher who was really down on dancing. And he would save up every year about the time when the school prom was going to be held, and he would preach his sermon on dancing. And he was really down on that. He never called it dancing. He always referred to it as shaking a wicked leg. So he was really down on that. He considered that the height of sin. And different ones have different concepts. Now you look through the Bible, and you have trouble, figuring out where some of these definitions came from, because they didn't come right out of the Bible. You look in the book of Ecclesiastes, for instance, where we're told there's a time for this and a time for that, and a time for other things, and we're told that all things have, a time and purpose under heaven, and we're told there that there's a time to dance. A time to dance, a time to mourn. So God says that. There's even a description of David dancing, bringing in the ark, and talks about dancing in the streets. The young, old men and children and young women and the whole works there in the picture of the millennium, of the time of Christ's rule on the earth. So many of the definitions that people have, that people cling to, ideas, concepts of what is sin. You can come up with all kinds of definitions depending on the background out of which someone comes. You have different ideas, different definitions. People think, well, this is sin, or that's sin, or other things are sin. You were to just ask people, it'd be incredible the number of definitions you'd get. Now, most of us are very familiar with a very simple definition found in 1 John 3:4, where we're told that sin equals the transgression of the law. And we have gone through and we've expounded that many times, that sin is the breaking of God's law. And so we have to go back to the Scriptures to find out what is God's law. We find that God's law is based on love, and that it involves love toward God and love toward neighbor. Loving God with our whole heart and loving our neighbor as ourselves. These are the two principles, Jesus said, on which hang all the law and the prophets. Everything else derives out from those two basic principles. We're familiar with that. The aspect that I would like to go in this morning, though, differs a little bit, not in the sense that it disagrees, but the approach that I want to focus on, since we are familiar with that definition of sin, the realization that sin is the transgression of the law, what we may not be familiar with is that there are many different words in the Bible that are all translated sin. Our Bible comes from, it was originally written in the Hebrew and in the Greek language. There are many different words in the Bible that are all translated sin, and they carry different shades of meaning. I would like to focus in on some specific words that are used in the Old Testament. And I think that as we understand that God names things, and He inspired a very colorful vocabulary to be used in Hebrew, that in fact, in the Hebrew language, there are about 15 different words for sin. 15 different words that all mean sin. There are quite a few in the New Testament. Now, I'm not going to go through all 15 in the Old and all 8 or 9 in the New, but I do want to focus in on 6 basic English definitions that would describe sin, and we'll look here at different words that render that, because in so doing, we get a little more deep perspective of what is sin, how we sin, how sin comes about, how God views sin. It's interesting that one word that is used in the Hebrew language that is translated sin is a word that could perhaps literally be translated trouble. We tell children something about now don't get into trouble. Don't do that. You're going to get into trouble. Well, there's a word in the Hebrew language, the word avon, is kind of like Avon, is the way it would be spelled out in English, avon, and it could pretty literally be translated trouble. And the emphasis on this particular word is the fact that sin leads to painful consequences. Now, that's a concept a lot of people don't have about sin. They think that God made things sin because He doesn't want people to have fun. That's the kind of the idea a lot of people seem to have. It's like they view sin as something that really would be fun to do. It would be enjoyable, but God doesn't like to see people enjoy themselves, and so He's made rules against everything. Well, that, of course, is not the case. What God says don't do, He tells us don't do because it leads to trouble. It leads to painful consequences, to a painful aftermath. Now, this word avon, it is most commonly rendered in the Old Testament when you read the word iniquity. The most common English rendering of this word is iniquity. But it could literally mean trouble. One example of this, because it means trouble it's a common word for sin, but it also is sometimes translated trouble or difficulty without a reference to sin. It's just a word that means trouble or difficulty. For instance, take an example in Genesis 35. Now, in Genesis 35, we have the story of Rachel in labor with her last child, her second son, Benjamin. Now, she originally was not going to name him Benjamin. Let me read here in Genesis 35, verse 16. They journeyed from Bethel, and there was but a little way to Ephrath. This is an area that later was known as Bethlehem. Just a little ways to Ephrath, and Rachel travailed. She had hard labor. And it came to pass when she was in hard labor, the midwife said unto her, "Fear not, you're going to have this son also." So the midwife was encouraging her that yes, it's going to work. Well, it came to pass as her soul was in departing, for she died. She was she did deliver the son, but she died in childbirth. That she called his name Benoni, as it's rendered here in English, or Ben-Avani, it would be another Hebrew rendering. His father, however, called him Benjamin. And Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, which is Bethlehem. So she was dying, and she named this son Ben-Avani. Now that means son of sorrow or son of trouble. That was what she started to name him. That was what she called him. He was the son of trouble, the son of real difficulty, because she was dying in that labor. And so the word here, the root word that's rendered here with this name is this word avon, which means trouble, a painful, difficult time. And his father, however, didn't want to call him son of trouble, so he called him Ben-Yamin, which meant son of my right hand instead of son of trouble. So you see, God inspired this particular word, which simply meant trouble. He inspired that to be the word that is very commonly used throughout the Old Testament to describe sin. It's a word that can refer just to trouble or difficulty, but it is a word that is very descriptive of sin because it focuses in on the consequences of sin. Sin always leads to trouble. Sometimes people have the idea, I hope no one finds out because then I won't get into trouble. Well, brethren, it's not that if no one finds out, I won't get into trouble. When I transgress, I am in trouble. I am bringing trouble upon myself. They're troublesome consequences. They're painful consequences that are automatically resulting from sin. It's a word that another place it's used in a way that here refers to trouble or mourning in Deuteronomy 26:14, where it is talking about the specific context here in Deuteronomy 26 had to do with the tithing structure that God had given Israel, and in verse 12 it makes reference to what the Jews termed a third tithe, which of course was not paid every year, but rather on the 3rd and 6th years of a 7-year cycle. And it was specifically used for the widows and the orphans. And so in verse 12, it's mentioned when you've made an end of tithing all the tithes of your increase the 3rd year, which is the year of tithing, that's the year that it all fell, and have given it to the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, the widow, that they're within your gates, then you're to go before God and say, you at the end of that time are to claim a special blessing. And that's what God told them. You're to claim a special blessing at the end of that year. You're to go before God and say, I have brought away the hallowed thing out of my house. You know, I've not kept back what was sanctified by you, but I have given it to the Levite, to the stranger, the fatherless, the widow, according to all the commandments which you have commanded me. I've not transgressed your commandments, neither have I forgotten them. I have not eaten thereof in my mourning, or in my trouble. And this word here, upon, the same word, in verse 14, it's translated mourning here, or trouble. Neither have I taken away aught thereof for any unclean use, or given aught thereof for the dead, but I've hearkened to the voice of the Lord our God. You know, it's kind of interesting, in Egypt, where Israel was coming from, Egypt virtually bankrupted itself to make monuments for the dead. They put all their emphasis and the wealth of the nation into providing for the afterlife, into building these pyramids and these great elaborate structures and all of this tremendous expenditure of wealth trying to preserve dead bodies. And they made a cult out of taking care of the dead. But while they were concentrating their energies and their efforts on the dead, they neglected the living. You know, that same principle we find today. I've seen sometimes funerals that I have attended where people seem to be the most grieved and just going on and on have been those that ignored the individual all during that person's lifetime, and then in death they're prepared to bankrupt themselves to, we've got to show how much we love dear so-and-so. But, maybe it'd been 5 years since they'd come and seen the person. Never sent them not even a sprig of a flower during their lifetime, but they're ready to do all of this in death. It's kind of interesting that it's in that context God mentions, this is kind of an aside, but it's a difference in God's concept and the pagan concept. God says, look, help people while they're alive. Take care of the widow and the needy and the poor. Take care of of elderly parents and grandparents and relatives. Take care of people that need help when your help is of value to them. Use it to help those who can profit from the help, which was a different concept than the pagan concept that was prevalent in Egypt. But anyway, the main point that I want to mention is here's this word again, but this time it is translated mourning, again trouble or grief. So here's a word that meant trouble, that meant mourning, that meant grief, that meant this difficulty. And yet when you go to the book of Psalms, where it is commonly used, Psalms 7, verse 14, it says, behold, he travails, he works with iniquity. He's conceived mischief and brought forth falsehood. Now this word that's translated iniquity here is this same word, upon. We could go into various other places. In Job 15:35 it says, they conceive mischief, bring forth vanity, and their belly prepares deceit. Well, this word here in verse 35 that's translated vanity of Job 15:35, the word translated vanity is the same word, iniquity. Throughout the Old Testament, most of the places where you see the word iniquity, it's this word upon. But what is the concept behind iniquity? It's trouble, it's grief, it's sorrow. What God is saying in His inspiration of the use of this word is that, look, trouble doesn't begin when somebody finds out what we did. Our trouble doesn't come from people. Our trouble, our grief, our sorrow is the natural effect from the cause of sin, of iniquity, of law-breaking. When we turn aside, it produces painful consequences in our lives. God tells us not to sin because He loves us, and He doesn't want us to get hurt. So that's really the first concept of sin that we see in the Old Testament, is it's a matter of getting hurt. Now there's another word that is also translated sin. The word ra'ah, you could spell it R-A-A, ra'ah. It has more the concept of evil or bad in the sense of being defective. For instance, notice an example in 2 Kings 4:41. 2 Kings 4:41. Here is an example that describes here some food that evidently there's some plants that had been gathered and this stew made, and it turned out that there was something poisonous in there. And this is the description here of something that a stew that had been made, and turned out maybe some mushrooms or something had been put in there that were poisonous. And so verse 41, they spoke to Elisha, and Elisha said, "Bring meal." And he cast the meal into the pot, and he said, "Pour out for the people that they may eat." And there was no harm in the pot. Now the word translated harm here, there was no evil thing, or there was nothing defective. It was not, Elisha performed a miracle, and everything became okay, whatever it was that was there that was poisonous was cleaned up. But the concept is there was nothing defective. There was nothing that was no evil thing, nothing that was bad in that sense. Another place where the word is used like that is in Proverbs 20 verse 14. And it talks here about two people, about somebody negotiating on a sale. And in verse 14, it is not, says the buyer, but when he goes away, then he boasts. So it's talking about somebody coming to buy something, and they're standing there haggling, and they say, that's no good, that's defective, it's not worth 2 cents. Oh, it's not worth anything. So they try to get the guy down, and when they walk away, then they're bragging, "Hey man, look at this bargain I got." Now, the word that is translated "not" here, which means nothing or defective, is this word ra'ah. So the person is saying to the buyer is saying to the seller, "Oh, that's defective. I think there's something wrong with that. You shouldn't be charging full price. That doesn't look. I don't think it's worth that. I'll give you so and so for it." And they're trying to negotiate. They're saying that this product isn't particularly good, that it is defective. And of course, afterward, they're real glad. They think they got a real bargain. And here's this word again, a word that simply means defective. It means there's something wrong with it. It means something that's bad. And it's used in that sense. But it's also used in the sense of morality, in the sense of right and wrong. That is the word that Moses used, God inspired Moses to use in Deuteronomy 30 verse 15. Where he told Israel, "See, I have set before you this day life and good and death and evil." The word is translated evil here in Deuteronomy 30 verse 15 is the same word, ra. God says that sin is defective. It is a defective lifestyle. It is a worthless, poisonous, defective, bad lifestyle. When Moses summed up what he set before Israel, the choice that he gave them, he's saying, "I set before you good and evil. I set before you what is good, what is wholesome, what is healthy, what is profitable, and what is defective, what is bad, what is worthless." So that's the contrast that's drawn. Another word that is translated sin, it's the word that's most commonly translated evil in the Old Testament. When you read the word evil, most of the time it comes from this word ra'ah, which simply means defective. It could be talking about some bad food you got a hold to that maybe had started spoiling. Or it could be talking about defective merchandise you would see in a store. Or it could be talking about lifestyle, conduct. Because you see, what do all those things have in common? They're defective. They're not what they ought to be. That's another concept of sin. Sin is evil. Sin is defective. It involves defective conduct. There's a defect. There's something that is not healthy and wholesome. Now, let's look at another word. Here's a word that carries a little different concept. This carries another concept, and that is the concept of rebellion. It is the word pasha, and it's a word that would, in a fairly literal sense, in fact, some places it's just simply rendered rebellion. So this is a concept of sin, that sin involves rebellion. Or sin can involve rebellion. Now we're going to see a little later that all sin does not involve an intentionally rebellious attitude. But a rebellious attitude is a sin. In Hosea chapter 8 and verse 1, it says, "Set the trumpet to your mouth. He shall come as an eagle against the house of the Lord, because they have transgressed my covenant and trespassed against my law." Now the word that is translated trespass here, trespassed in Hosea 8 verse 1, is this word, pasha, which means rebellion. They have rebelled against my law. God refers to this nation as having rebelled against His law, of having resented the authority of the law of God and a rebellion against that authority, because rebellion is a resentment of the authority over us. It's a word that's used back in Isaiah 48 in verse 8. In Isaiah 48 in verse 8, it says, "Yea, you heard not, yea, you knew not, yea, from the time that your ear was not opened, for I knew that you would deal very treacherously and were called a transgressor from the womb." Now this again is a reference to the nation, and the word transgressor here is the same word, ra'ah. A rebellious nature, an attitude of resentment toward God's authority. And that, of course, is a very serious matter. Let's notice another instance of the word. It's used in Psalm 28, or Proverbs 28, rather. Proverbs 28, 21. It says, "To have respect of persons is not good, for a piece of bread that man will transgress," will rebel. The word transgress here is the same word as ra'ah, rebellion. It says, "To have respect of persons is not good." To show favoritism with people. For a piece of bread, that man is going to rebel. In other words, if he starts to get ahead, somebody offers him a little more. He is someone that is, this talks about the characteristic of someone playing politics. Someone who is not consistent in his behavior and his attitude toward people. He is not someone that treats everyone in a fair and impartial way. But he tries to play the angles. And if he thinks it's to his advantage, he will butter up to this person and treat him better, treat him differently. But it says for a piece of bread he'll transgress. You give him a little bit and he'll rebel. He will go over to the other side. It's a word this word ra'ah has the concept of rebel, of an intentional disloyalty. A resentment toward authority, a disloyalty. So that's a concept of sin. of transgressing, of rebelling. It might be described of the attitude of the nation toward God's law. It might be described here as the attitude of someone toward other people with whom they deal. That they're not to be counted upon. That they're not people that are fair, that are honest and honorable and above board in all their dealings, but they will go over one way or the other depending on whether it is to their advantage. Maybe notice just one other use of the word. In Psalm 37 verse 38 it says, "The transgressors shall be destroyed together. The end of the wicked shall be cut off." The transgressors are the rebels. So it's used in the sense of those who are going to be destroyed. That's the consequence. Ties in with Mr. Tigen's sermonette. That's what God is going to do with the sinners, with those who are rebellious against His laws, who will not yield to Him, is they're going to be destroyed. Not simply tortured forever, but destroyed. The end of the wicked will be cut off. So this concept of pasha, of rebellion, an attitude of disloyalty and resentment toward the authority of God, and disloyalty in our relationships with others. A transgressor, a rebel. Now there's another word that is used, zema, that has to do with a scheme, a plot, evil that is planned and premeditated ahead of time. That's a different concept. See, a different thing. This word for rebellion or pasha has to do with an attitude, a state of mind, one of resentment toward authority, of disloyalty to a person or a cause, the attitude of rebellion. Other words that we've seen have to do more with consequence or with a category of a catalog of what sin is like, that sin is defective conduct or it's conduct that leads to trouble. This is a word, zema, that has to do with a scheme, a plot, something, an evil plan, something that somebody has hatched up in their mind. It involves premeditated evil. It's the word that's used in Genesis 11 verse 6. Genesis 11, verse 6. The Lord said, "Behold, the people is one. They have all one language, and this they began to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do." The word that's translated imagined here, we're going to see a little later, it's a word that's also used for sin. It's translated imagined here, but the concept is the people have planned something, and it is an evil thing. It's a plot. They have started on this Tower of Babel, and nothing that they can scheme or plot is going to be restrained. Because they're going to carry out all kinds of schemes and plots if we don't do something to stop this. Now, the root word here of zema can be used of any plan, even in the sense of being discreet or using discretion. It can't. The root word is something that can have a good meaning as well, in the sense of something that's planned ahead. But it is a word that, used in a negative sense, has to do with an evil plan, a plot, a scheme, something that is hatched up ahead of time for no good purpose. The Tower of Babel was the beginning of a plot, a scheme that was going to lead to all kinds of consequences. And that, of course, again, is a serious matter. And in Deuteronomy 19:19, we have another use here. Let's notice the story. Let's pick it up in verse 16 of Deuteronomy 19. "If a false witness rise up against any man to testify against him which is that which is wrong." So here's somebody who is going to perjure his testimony. He's going to say things that aren't true to get someone else into trouble.
Then both of the men, between whom the controversy is, shall stand before the Eternal, before the priests and the judges, which shall be in those days. And the judges shall make diligent inquisition. And behold, if the witness be a false witness, and is testified falsely against his brother, then shall you do unto him as he had thought to do unto his brother. So shall you put the evil away from among you. Now, the word here is the same word, plot or scheme. You shall do to him as he had schemed and plotted to do to his brother. This involved premeditated sin. It involved someone going in with the intent of perjuring himself to get somebody else into trouble. This was a plot. It was a scheme. It was premeditated sin. And God said the consequences in ancient Israel for perjury was whatever the person was on trial for, whatever the punishment would have been had your testimony been believed, that's what you got. It'd be kind of a disincentive for perjury, wouldn't it? You go in, you realize you testify falsely against someone, and anybody finds out, they weren't simply going to fine you, they weren't just going to stick you in jail for a little while, they were going to do to you what you were trying to get done to the other fellow. So, it was a very serious matter. God takes that kind of thing very seriously. Let's notice back in Psalm 37. In Psalm 37, in verse 12, here we notice the same word. The wicked plots against the just and gnashes upon him with his teeth. Now, this word here is translated plot. It involves premeditated sin. The wicked plots against the just. It involves premeditated sin. It is a plan, a scheme to defraud, to take advantage of, to misuse. It's a very serious term, a very serious concept, and something that God absolutely hates. This attitude of someone sitting down and plotting and scheming to take advantage of someone else, to misuse or abuse another human being. In Proverbs 30 verse 32 it says, if you have done foolishly, Proverbs 30 verse 32, if you have done foolishly in lifting up yourself, or if you have thought evil, now here it's translated thought evil, lay your hand upon your mouth. If you have plotted something, then you better stop before it goes any further. So this is a concept of planned evil. Now, I want to look at two other English concepts that I want to spend a little more time on, and in each of these we'll notice different words. Another concept. We've seen the concept of trouble, the concept of what is defective, the concept of rebellion, the concept of plots and schemes. Fifth concept is the concept of guilt. The concept of guilt. Now there are three different Hebrew words that carry this connotation. The connotation that someone is alienated from God. Someone is guilty. One of these words is a word that rasha. It, in a literal sense, it generally refers to the breakdown of social relationships. Something that is wicked, is criminal, something that violates the rights of others, that does damage to the community. It's a word that God used in describing some of the kings of ancient Israel and Judah, and some of the guilt that was the result of some of their actions. In 2 Chronicles chapter 20 and verse 35, for instance, it says, after this did Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, join himself with Ahaziah, king of Israel, who did very wickedly. Now, if you go back in this description of Ahaziah as one who did very wickedly, who did things that produced a lot of guilt. It is a word that specifically had reference to the way that he carried out his community responsibilities, the way he dealt with others in the position and the authority that he had. For instance, in 2 Chronicles 22 and verse 3, it refers here to Ahaziah, again, describing him, and it says he walked. Well, actually, this is Ahaziah, the king of Judah, and it says in verse 3, he walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, for his mother, Athaliah, who was Jezebel's daughter, his mother was his counselor to do wickedly, to misuse other people, to treat others in a wrong way. His mother, in this case, was not a counselor to do right, but a counselor to do wickedly. It had to do with violating the rights of others in the community. You know, a good example, Jezebel was notorious for that. You remember the story where she hatched up this plot or scheme to steal Naboth's vineyard for Ahab, to violate what was right, to violate the rights of others in the community, to mistreat. And it has to do specifically with a breaking down of relationships that ought to exist among people in a community. And this is a serious matter. And the word is often rendered guilt, or it is rendered wickedly, here as it is in verse 3. It's a word that's often rendered wicked. And it has that concept of what is wicked or what produces guilt. Another word that is rendered iniquity, generally, is generally rendered iniquity, and again carries that concept of guilt, is a word aven, or avon. And it means crooked behavior, something that is warped, something that is twisted, that is bent, behavior that is not as it ought to be. Let's notice an example back in Genesis. In Genesis chapter 15, in verse 16, here in verse 15, the statement was made to Abram, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You're going to be buried in a good old age, but in the fourth generation, they shall come here again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. God said, I'm not ready to dispossess the Amorites yet. Their guilt is not yet piled up high enough. Their iniquity, their iniquity or their guilt has not yet reached the point where I'm ready to just kick them out. It's the same word. It is the word that is translated iniquity, for instance, in Exodus 20, verse 5, in the Ten Commandments, where God talks about idolatry, and He says, visiting the iniquities of the fathers upon the children. Let's notice here in Exodus 20, verse 5. Verse 4 says, you shall not make unto you any graven image, or any likeness. A graven image would be like a statue, and a likeness would be like a drawing or a painting of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down yourself to them, nor serve them. So there was not to be this representation as this had to do, obviously, with images that involved religious worship, articles of religious devotion. So God says, don't do that. Don't bow down to them. Doesn't matter what it is, whether it's something that a person or an animal or something that you conceive of as being in heaven. Don't make images and likenesses for the purpose of religious devotion. Don't bow down yourself or serve them. I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generation of them that hate me. Visiting the iniquity, the guilt. Now, what does God mean? God doesn't look down and pick on you because of what your parents and grandparents did. What it means is that Sin carries consequences that last for generations. We are the products of the family and the society in which we grow up. And there are consequences of iniquity. There are consequences of guilt. Specifically, it's mentioned here in the context of idolatry because the reason God is so opposed to idolatry is it gets in our way of conceiving, of understanding the true, invisible, powerful, ruling God. Yet, humanly devised ideas. We get man's imagination in the way of God's revelation. You know, it stands in the way. It's interesting. You know, you go back and you read. It's even a matter of record. You can look up in the Catholic Encyclopedia and they will readily admit that for even the first few centuries, the idea of making representations of God and things that pertain to God was something that was avoided as a basis of this commandment. And as a result of pagan influences on in the 4th century and later, it became common. That's one of the reasons, of course, that if you do any research on it, you'll find there are no contemporary pictures. There's no picture of Jesus Christ that dates back earlier than several centuries after His death. And any encyclopedia article, if you research it out, even the Catholic Encyclopedia will tell you there are no contemporary representations. The first representations that are known of were several centuries afterward. Why? Well, they will tell you that because of Jewish sensibilities, that's their term, because of Jewish sensibilities, this kind of thing was avoided, but later on, you know, Romans kind of gained the upper hand and we didn't pay any attention to those, quote, Jewish sensibilities. And so things come in. Well, here it's mentioned in the concept of idolatry. And then, of course, this commandment was embarrassing, so they went back, and as you remember from, those of you who had catechism class, you didn't memorize this commandment. It was numbered out. They renumbered the commandments. There's no question as to the commandments, and the Jews, of course, have preserved it, and it's mentioned that there were 10 of them. It says in Deuteronomy, there were 10, so if you're going to leave one out, you had to go in and divide up covetousness into two. So they redivided, for the purposes of catechism, the 10 commandments, renumbered them to leave out the one against idolatry, because that's rather embarrassing, you see, to try to sit there and explain to little kids who take everything literally, that you shouldn't make idols, and they say, well, what's that hanging on the wall? So that's embarrassing. You see, they didn't want to be in the position of doing that, so they decided the simplest thing to do, leave it out. Just don't tell them that one, and then we'll split up the one on covetousness into two. Don't covet your neighbor's wife, and don't covet your neighbor's house, and we'll say, well, that means, that's two totally different commandments. Well, when Christ summarized them in the New Testament, He listed covetousness as being one. I just don't covet. But the point is that when it says visiting the iniquities, it's used in the sense, idolatry inevitably has cut people off from God. It has introduced, and people can make idols out of many things. We think of idolatry as being somebody bowing down to some leering statue, Dagon, the fish god, or whatever. But people can concoct various ideas, various images. Their idolatry involves false images, false concepts, things that interfere with, that get in our way of worshiping the true and living God. And it produces iniquity. And those iniquities go down from generation to generation in the sense that there are consequences of guilt. A whole society becomes cut off from God through idolatry, and as a result of being cut off, there are all kinds of other problems that come in. In Psalm 103, verse 3, where it talks about God who forgives all your iniquities, who heals all your diseases, the word iniquity, same word here, avon. It means iniquity. It means that which involves guilt. Now, let's look at another word that carries on this concept of guilt, of being alienated from God. It's a word that's usually rendered trespass. It is the word asham, and it means alienated from God or trespass. In Leviticus chapter 5 and verse 7, it's rendered as a trespass offering. In Isaiah 53 verse 10, a prophecy of the Messiah, it talks about Christ offering Himself as a sacrifice, as an offering for sin, as a trespass offering, an offering for sin, and it's the same word, asham. It is a word that is used in again, various places, generally rendered trespass. In Proverbs 14:9, it says, "Fools make a mock at sin." Now, it's rendered sin here. It's the same word, asham. Fools think sin is a joke. They think that guilt, that trespass, that guilt that required the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, they treat it as a joke. They treat it lightly. They don't view sin as a big deal. They view it as a joke. So, sin involves the concept of guilt. It involves trouble. It involves what is defective. It can involve rebellion. It can involve a scheme or a plot. It can involve the concept of guilt. And there's one other concept, and this is the one that is most frequently used in the Old Testament, and it is the one, I think, that applies most commonly to us. And it is the word that means wandering off. Wandering off. Missing the mark. The most common word in the Old Testament, most of the time, probably 2/3, 3/4 of the time when you read the word sin in the Old Testament, it comes from the Hebrew word katah. And it's a word that means to miss the mark. It's a word that is used, for instance, in Judges chapter 20, verse 16, and it talks about these archers, these Benjamite archers, that were real crack shots, and it said that every one of them, they were left-handed, and they could shoot and never miss the mark. Never miss the mark. They were excellent crack shots with a bow and arrow. And it refers to this whole contingent of Benjamite troops that were crack shots that never missed the mark. The word that's used there is the word katah. And that's the word that most of the time you read the word sin, it's used. That's what sin very frequently involves. It involves missing the mark. Now, these Benjamites didn't miss the mark when it came to archery. But when you read the story in Judges chapter 20, you find out they missed the mark on something more important. They missed the mark spiritually. But they didn't miss the mark physically. It is to miss the mark. It doesn't mean a premeditated plot or a scheme. It doesn't mean rebellion. It means missing the mark. And this is something that we all have to be on guard. It's a word that is used over and over. In Genesis 4:7, when God warned Cain, Cain was in a foul attitude because God had not approved his sacrifice. God warned Cain and He said, "Sin lies at the door. And its desire is going to be to master you and to rule over you. Don't let it happen." The word is translated sin there in Genesis 4:7 is this word katah. Missing the mark. You know, Cain, you're beginning to deviate. Now, if you ever, in school, if you ever studied any trigonometry, if you ever studied the plotting of trajectories, one of the things that you realize is that at the point of origin, if there is the slightest deviation, the further you go, the wider that deviation becomes. The further the mark is missed. Now, for instance, when they were going to be sending the first men to the moon, they did a lot of plotting of trajectories. Because if they had missed the mark by so much as a fraction of an inch on Earth, by the time it got 240,000 miles up in the air, it would have missed the mark by a long shot. They would have widely missed the mark. You know, you start out, and many of us have, for instance, shot rifles, and you hold that bead on the target, and if you deviate it just a little bit, by the time it gets to the target, you see it will deviate off. If we get off, if we don't hold it on, if it misses the mark, it sets a trajectory, and the further out it travels, the trajectory is different, and it goes further and further away. Missing the mark. That's something that is important, that we have to, in our lives, to be on target. That's one of the most important concepts of sin. It's the one that's most commonly used. Of being, the importance of being on target. Of not missing the mark. We could go through Scripture after Scripture, because as I say, most places in the Old Testament where the word sin is used is a reference to kata. Now there's another word that is used that means to deviate, which again carries this concept of missing the mark. It's a word aval. It's used 60 times in the Old Testament. It's a word, for instance, that is used in Leviticus 19, verse 15. It says, "You shall do no unrighteousness in judgment. You shall not respect the person of the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty, but in righteousness shall you judge your neighbor. You shall do no unrighteousness." There is to be no deviation in judgment, no missing of the mark by showing favoritism. Either bending over and showing favoritism to someone because they're poor and you unfairly deal. You know, it can apply both ways. I mean, you can discriminate against someone because they're poor. You can discriminate against someone because they're rich. It involves a prejudiced attitude towards someone, and God said, those in authority said, I don't want you going off the deep end either direction. Don't show favoritism to someone because they're rich and powerful, nor on the other hand, don't be prejudiced against them because they're rich and powerful. Don't play favorites. That's what he said. Be fair. Be consistent. Don't show unrighteousness in judgment. Don't show deviation. Don't get off the mark. Don't wander off path. This is the word that Job used in Job 34. Job 34, verse 32. Job said, that which I see not, teach you me. If I've done iniquity, I'll do no more. If I've wandered off, if I've deviated. Now see, the only thing Job was willing to admit up to this point, he said, look, I know I have not rebelled. I know I've not plotted and schemed evil things. I know I haven't done any of these things. I may have deviated from the path. I may have wandered off a little bit. If I have, show me and I'll get back on track. Well, this word aval carries the concept of getting off track. Mr. Armstrong, back in the last years of his life, put emphasis on the fact that he felt that God had brought him back to put the church back on the track, and that metaphor was used quite a bit. That was there, and there was a lot of humor that some noticed in the fact that there was a little restaurant near the campus where some of the students went, and for a number of years it was down there. There's a railroad track that's fairly near the campus. This was a little restaurant, and the name of the restaurant was the Loose Caboose. And it changed management. This is literally true. It changed management around 1979 or 1980, and it went out of business, and then it changed management. When it came back, it had a new name. It was called the Right Track Cafe. And people around campus joked about it because it was so funny, the choice of words, because Mr. Armstrong was emphasizing right around that time that he was trying to put things back on the track. Well, this word aval has to do with being off track, deviating, wandering off the path. It's not a premeditated plot or scheme or rebellion. It's wandering off the path. And that is sin. Sin involves missing the mark. It involves deviating or wandering off the path. One more word that is a very interesting word. The word shagah. And it means something similar. It means to go astray or to err, to sin inadvertently. It's used 21 times in the Old Testament. And it is frequently used, or it is a word that would be used to describe what would happen to a sheep. There was a very interesting comment in one of the reference books that I was studying this morning. In this word here is a word is used in Ezekiel 34 verse 6. Notice in verse 5, Ezekiel 34:5, they were scattered because there is no shepherd, and they became meat to all the beasts of the field when they were scattered. My sheep wandered. Shagah. My sheep wandered through all the mountains and upon every high hill. Yea, my flock was scattered upon the face of the earth, and none did search or seek after them. It's talking about God's people, talking about sheep wandering off. The commentary made an interesting observation this morning, or it made the observation all along. I read it this morning. The observation was, how do sheep wander off? How do sheep go astray? They nibble themselves astray. What do? They nibble their way to being lost. The sheep is, he's trying to eat, and he looks over here and he sees a little green sprig, he sees a little grass, and he thinks that looks pretty good. So he goes over there, and he, eats that, and then he looks, and he sees something a little further over, and he wanders, and he keeps going, and pretty soon, he's wandered off away from the other sheep, and he's off in the woods somewhere, because the grass kept looking a little greener on the other side. The sheep didn't start out to get lost because he said, hey, what I really want to do is to be attacked by wolves today. It's just kind of my ambition as a sheep, is to, have the wolves swoop down on me. No. But the sheep wanders astray. God compares His people here to wandering astray. To, in a sense, kind of nibbling their way along. That's one of the reasons that compromise is such an insidious thing. Because when we begin to water down and to compromise little things, we begin to, a little green sprig over here, and another one over there, and another one over here, and something else there. It's interesting, in the book of Proverbs, this word is used in 3 different occasions. And it's kind of interesting. As I mentioned, it's used 21 times in the Old Testament. It means to go astray, but it's interesting the context in which it's used in the book of Proverbs. In Proverbs 20, verse 1, it is used in the context of wine and strong drink. Now, if you look at it here, when it talks about that wine is a mocker, and whoever is deceived by it is not wise, it uses it in the context of someone going astray, being led astray through the abuse of alcohol. Now, there is a right use. Certainly we know that. We understand. Jesus turned water into wine. It's not that any use of alcohol is wrong, but there are an awful lot of people whose lives have been grossly distorted and destroyed as a result of being made a fool out of by alcohol. That's why it says wine is a mocker. And that is, in the book of Proverbs, when it uses this word, shagah, it uses it in the context of alcohol. It uses it in the context in Proverbs 5 of seductive, strange women. And in Proverbs 19 and verse 27, it uses it in the concept of an inability to reject the wrong kind of instructions. The wrong kind of instructions. It says, for instance, in Proverbs 19:27, cease, my son, to hear the instruction that causes to err from the words of knowledge. So the causes to err here is this word, shagah, to go astray. You listen to the wrong kind of instructions. So it's interesting that on the basis of Proverbs, how does Proverbs focus in on sheep going astray? Sheep in the sense of people. It focuses in on the misuse of alcohol. It focuses in on getting involved with in the wrong use of sex, specifically what is termed the strange woman of Proverbs 5. It also involves hanging around with the wrong people, taking the wrong kind of advice, wrong associations. You know, the point is, so many times when people began to play with some of these things and began to get further and further off, they began a trajectory that takes them off track. We're told in the New Testament that Satan the devil goes about as a roaring lion, seeking whom he might devour. Which sheep is he going to devour? Those that have wandered off. Those that have wandered away. This is a concept that sin involves wandering off. It involves a deviation and missing the mark. It involves wandering off. We can't afford to nibble ourselves astray. You know, continually looking at the grass looks a little greener over here, a little greener over there, and we kind of nibble along, you see, on the way. It's a very important concept. And I think the concept that perhaps has most relevance to us, because the most likely problems for those who are God's people to be involved in are those that involve a wandering away. Somehow missing the mark, kind of wandering off, getting the trajectory wrong, and beginning to get further and further astray. Though any of these concepts, sin involves trouble, it involves that which is defective, it involves rebellion, it can involve plotting and scheming, it certainly involves a concept of guilt and alienation from God, and it involves most frequently simply wandering off track. Wandering off, missing the mark. Brethren, God uses a very rich vocabulary to describe what is sin. Uses many different words for sin in the Old Testament as well as the New. And He uses this vocabulary to give us a range of understanding the concept of what is involved in sin. Yes, sin is the transgression of the law, but sin involves so many different things that all tie in, that it's important for us to understand, so that we can keep our eyes on Jesus Christ, the true shepherd, and that we can be where He is, that we can be on track in our lives, that we can be seeking Him and serving Him and walking with Him, and then regardless, you know, we don't have to fear any evil, because our shepherd will be with us, will guard us, protect us, because we're going to be where He is. So, let's take to heart God's admonition and instruction, and let's apply in our lives a deeper understanding of what it means to sin against God.